The dust of the high plains settled on everything Caleb Sutton owned, a fine gritty powder that coated the windows of his ranch house, the brim of his hat, and the silence in his heart. He stood on his porch, watching the 3 members of the Blackwood Creek Town Council ride up the long, winding path to his door. Their presence was never a good omen. Mayor Thompson, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his waistcoat, dismounted with a huff, his face a mask of feigned sympathy. "Caleb," he began, his voice too loud in the quiet air, "a difficult matter has come to our attention." Caleb did not invite them in. He leaned against a porch post, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his gaze as hard and unyielding as the land around him. He had wrested this ranch from the wilderness with his own 2 hands after his father passed, turning a patch of stubborn earth into the most prosperous spread in the territory. He had done it alone, and he preferred it that way. "Spit it out, Henry," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. The mayor cleared his throat, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "It concerns your father's will, a particular clause we were, reminded of recently." He unfolded the paper with a dramatic crinkle. "It states that upon the 5-year anniversary of his death, full and indivisible title to this land shall pass to his eldest son, provided the son has taken a wife and shown a commitment to establishing a family, as is proper and godly." Caleb's jaw tightened. 5 years. That anniversary was less than 2 months away. "And if he has not?" Caleb asked, though he already knew the answer. The smug look on Councilman Miller's face was answer enough. "Then title passes to the next of kin who has met said requirements," the mayor continued, his eyes darting away from Caleb's cold stare. "In this case, your cousin, Bartholomew." Bartholomew, a soft, grasping man who had married a wealthy merchant's daughter and produced 3 loud, spoiled children. A man who looked at Caleb's land with an undisguised, slavering greed. It was Bartholomew, no doubt, who had reminded the council of this forgotten clause. They saw a way to bring Caleb Sutton, the man who wanted nothing from them, to heel. They wanted his land taxes, his political support, and a piece of his influence, things he had steadfastly denied them. "This is a private family matter," Caleb stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "The will was filed with the town. Caleb, it is a legal matter now," Mayor Thompson insisted, taking a step back. "The council must uphold the law. You have until the end of next month. Find yourself a wife, a proper one, or we'll have no choice but to begin proceedings to transfer the deed." They mounted their horses, their duty done, leaving Caleb alone in the swirling dust. He looked out over the vast expanse of his land, the rolling hills that bled into the distant, purple mountains, the creek that glittered like a silver vein in the valley, the herds of cattle that were the result of his sweat and blood. He had built this place as a fortress against the world, a place where he needed no one. The memory of betrayal was a sharp, jagged thing in his chest. He remembered a soft voice, vows of forever that had turned to ash, and a profound grief that had walled him off from the warmth of another person's touch. Love, he had learned, was a fool's game, a weakness that could cost a man everything. But the land was not a weakness. The land was real, solid, something he could trust. He would not lose it to Bartholomew's conniving. He would not lose it because he refused to play their game of polite society. If they wanted a wife, he would give them one. But she would be a wife in name only, a shield against their legal thievery, not a balm for a heart he had long since locked away. He strode into the house, the slam of the door echoing the finality of his decision. He sat at his heavy oak desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and dipped a pen in ink. His hand, more accustomed to the grip of a branding iron or the reins of a horse, moved with stiff, deliberate strokes. He wrote an advertisement for the Eastern papers, the words as stark and devoid of sentiment as the man himself. Wanted, a wife of respectable character for a formal arrangement. Must be willing to relocate to a remote ranch in the West. All needs will be provided for. No other expectations. Marriage will be one of convenience only. Respond via telegraph to C. Sutton, Blackwood Creek. He read it over once, the words looking foreign and desperate on the page. It felt like a surrender, but it was a calculated one. He was hiring a woman, not courting her. He was buying a signature for a marriage license. Nothing more. The ad was a lie and the truth all at once. He was offering a home, but not a heart. Shelter, but not solace. He sealed the letter and knew, with a grim certainty, that he was trading one kind of loneliness for another. Hundreds of miles to the east, the train whistle cut through the damp, gray morning like a scream. Lily Hart clutched the single of worn leather bag on her lap, its contents meager and precious. Inside, nestled between two threadbare dresses and a small book of poems, was a letter. The paper was crisp, the ink a confident, flowing script, and every word of it was a lie. It was a letter of good conduct, purportedly from the minister of her former parish, praising her piety, her gentle nature, and her unimpeachable moral character. She had paid a disgraced clerk a whole $1 for it, a sum that had left her with barely enough for her train ticket. She watched the smoke-choked cities of the east recede, giving way to rolling farmland and then, gradually, to the vast, untamed emptiness of the plains. The landscape felt like a reflection of her own soul, scoured clean, empty, yet holding the potential for something new to grow, or for nothing at all. She was running, not towards a new life, but away from the smoldering ruins of her old one. The scandal had been a quiet, suffocating thing. It had begun with a boy's clumsy, unwanted advances and ended with her being branded a temptress, a liar. She was the daughter of a simple tailor, he the son of the town's most powerful pastor. In the court of public opinion, her word was worth less than dust. The whispers followed her everywhere, sharp and venomous, until she could no longer walk to the market without feeling the sting of a dozen pairs of eyes. She was cast out not with a formal decree, but with the slow, crushing weight of shunning. Doors closed to her. Friends turned away. Her father, a man broken by grief and shame, had looked at her one evening and said, with hollow eyes, "It would be better if you went away." And so she had, his words, more than any of the town's gossip, had been the final, brutal cut. She had seen the advertisement in a discarded newspaper, the words stark and cold. A formal arrangement. No other expectations. It sounded less like a marriage and more like a job, which was something she could understand. It promised provision, safety, and most importantly, anonymity. The man, C. Sutton, did not want a lover or a companion. He wanted a placeholder, a ghost to occupy a space in his house. Lily felt she was uniquely qualified for the role. She had been a ghost in her own home for months. The journey was long, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a constant companion to her thoughts. She was terrified. She was trading a familiar prison for an unknown one. But as the sky grew wider and the land more rugged, a tiny, stubborn seed of hope began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. Out here, no one knew her name. No one knew the lies that had been told about her. Here, she could be invisible, and from invisibility, perhaps she could one day rebuild a life. When the train finally ground to a halt at the small, sun-bleached depot of Blackwood Creek, Lily's hands were trembling. She stepped onto the platform, the dry heat a stark contrast to the damp chill of the east she had left behind. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with raw, unpainted wooden buildings. It looked harsh and temporary, as if it could be blown away by a strong wind. A man stood waiting at the far end of the platform. Apart from the few others who had gathered, he was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in sturdy, practical clothes coated with the same fine dust that seemed to cover everything. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of hardship. not laughter. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on her. There was no welcome in them, only assessment. This had to be Caleb Sutton. She walked towards him, her steps measured, her back straight. She had practiced this moment in her mind. She would be composed, respectful, and distant. She would be exactly what he had advertised for. "Miss Hart?" he asked, his voice even rougher than she had imagined. "Mr. Sutton," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. She kept her eyes fixed on the knot of his tie, unable to meet the intensity of his gaze. He took her bag from her hand, his knuckles brushing against hers for a fleeting second. His touch was rough, calloused, and surprisingly warm. He seemed to notice the contact too, pulling his hand back quickly. He looked her over, a long, searching look that made her feel as though he could see right through her thin dress to the forged letter and the secrets she kept hidden beneath. She was beautiful. He noted with a detached sense of surprise, not in a flashy saloon girl way, but with a delicate, fine-boned elegance that seemed entirely out of place here. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pinned up neatly, and her skin was pale, untouched by the sun. But it was her stillness that struck him most. She stood with a quiet dignity, a poise that he had not expected from a woman answering an ad like his. Yet she would not meet his eyes, keeping her gaze lowered as if studying the dust on her own worn boots. "The sheriff is waiting," he said abruptly, turning without another word. "We'll get this done." The ceremony was as swift and barren as he had promised. It took place in the sheriff's small, cluttered office, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco and old paper. The witnesses were Sheriff Brody, a weary-looking man with a drooping mustache, and one of Caleb's ranch hands, a young man named Jake who twisted his hat in his hands and looked anywhere but at the bride and groom. The justice of the peace, who also served as the town's barber, rushed through the words as if he were late for a haircut. Caleb's responses were clipped. Lily's were so soft they were nearly inaudible. When the justice declared them man and wife, an awkward silence descended. Caleb did not kiss her. He did not even take her hand. He simply signed the ledger, his signature a sharp, angry slash of ink. Lily signed below him, her own handwriting a stark contrast, careful, elegant, and controlled. There was no celebration, no well wishes beyond a gruff nod from the sheriff. The entire affair was over in less than 10 minutes. It was a transaction, completed with the grim efficiency of a cattle sale. The ride to the ranch was silent. Caleb drove the buckboard, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his shoulders set in a rigid line. Lily sat beside him, her hands folded primly in her lap, watching the landscape roll by. The ranch house was miles from town, nestled in a valley that was beautiful and deeply isolated. The house itself was solid and well built, made of thick, hewn logs, but it had a stark, unlived-in quality. It was a shelter, not a home. He led her inside, the interior dark and cool after the bright sun. The main room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace, the furniture sparse and functional, a large table, a few sturdy chairs, a worn sofa. Everything was clean, but there was no softness, no sign of a woman's touch. It was the home of a man who lived, but took no joy in it. He gestured towards a closed door. "That will be your room," he said, his tone flat and businesslike. "My room is at the other end of the hall. You will have your privacy, and I expect mine." He turned to face her fully then, his expression unreadable. "Let us be clear about the terms of this arrangement. Mrs. Sutton," he said, the new title sounding strange and hollow in the quiet room. "You are here to satisfy a legal requirement. In return, you will have a roof over your head, food on the table, and my protection. I will ask nothing more of you. I expect you to cook and keep the house in order, but you are not my servant, and you are not my wife, in any way that matters. Is that understood?" Lily finally lifted her gaze and met his eyes. She saw the deep-seated pain there, the walls he had built around himself, and she understood it in a way he would never guess. She knew about walls. She had been building her own for a very long time. A faint, unreadable smile touched her lips for a moment. It was not a smile of happiness or contentment, but of quiet, weary acceptance. "I understand completely, Mr. Sutton," she said. The news of Caleb Sutton's marriage hit Blackwood Creek like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. Gossip, the town's most plentiful crop, grew wild and fast. By evening, the story had been told and retold a dozen times in the general store, over the bar at the saloon, and across the picket fences that separated one small, judgmental life from another. "Can you believe it? Caleb Sutton, married!" Martha Gable, the store owner's wife, exclaimed, her voice a sharp squawk. "And to who? No one's ever seen her before. She just stepped off the train this morning." "I heard she's a mail-order bride," whispered another woman, leaning closer as if sharing a state secret. "Paid for like a sack of flour. And pretty, they say, too pretty. If you ask me, a man like Caleb doesn't just up and marry a pretty stranger for no reason." In the saloon, the talk was cruder. The saloon girls, who had long speculated on the nature of the handsome, reclusive rancher's loneliness, felt a collective sense of being cheated. "He never gave any of us the time of day." One of them, a redhead named Sadie, complained as she wiped down the bar. "And now he brings in some pale, quiet little thing from back east? Bet she's got secrets. A girl doesn't travel that far alone unless she's running from something." The consensus was clear. The woman was a mystery, and the marriage was a sham. Caleb Sutton, who had kept himself apart from the town for so long, had finally done something interesting, and they were all determined to pick it apart until they found the ugly truth at its center. He was a recluse, and his new bride was a strange, too pretty outsider. It was a scandal in the making, and the town settled in to watch it unfold. Back at the isolated ranch, the sun bled away behind the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Lily prepared a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and fresh bread. They ate in silence at the large table, the clinking of their forks against the tin plates the only sound. The distance between them felt as vast and empty as the prairie outside. When the meal was over, Caleb rose from the table. "Good night, Mrs. Sutton," he said, his voice formal, and disappeared down the hall to his room. Lily was left alone in the main room, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She cleaned the kitchen meticulously, moving with a quiet efficiency that was born of long practice. When everything was put away, she walked to her own room and closed the door. The room was as sparse as the rest of the house, a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a small wooden dresser, and a single window that looked out into the profound darkness of the night. It was a room for sleeping, not for living. She undressed slowly, her movements weary. The dress she wore, her best one, felt like a costume. Beneath it, she wore a simple cotton shift. As she stood there in the moonlight that streamed through the window, she ran her fingers lightly over her side, just above her hip. The skin there was raised and rough, a network of old scars that were a permanent reminder of a struggle in a dark alley, of a boy's vicious anger when she had fought him off. They were scars no one had ever seen, the physical evidence of a story no one had ever believed. A single, silent tear traced a path down her cheek, then another. She sank onto the edge of the bed, a small, trembling figure in the vast, lonely house. The grief and shame she had held at bay for so long washed over her in a silent, suffocating wave. She cried without a sound, her body shaking with the force of her sorrow. She was Mrs. Sutton now, a wife in name, but she had never felt more alone. She curled up on the bed, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. The fabric was rough against her skin. She whispered the words into the darkness, a promise to herself, a mantra for the difficult days she knew were ahead. "Survival matters more than pride," she breathed, her voice raspy with unshed tears. For now, outside, the wind howled a lonesome tune, and the vast, indifferent wilderness kept its watch. The days on the Sutton Ranch bled into one another, each marked by the rising and setting of a relentless sun. Life was stripped to its essential, unforgiving elements: work, eat, sleep. For Lily, it was a brutal education. Her hands, once accustomed to the delicate work of embroidery, grew rough and calloused from kneading dough, scrubbing floors with harsh lye soap and hauling buckets of water from the well until her arms ached with a deep, burning fire. The silence of the house was a physical presence, a constant companion that pressed in on her from all sides. In the east, she had been suffocated by whispers. Here, she was being erased by the lack of them. She learned. She watched Jake, the young ranch hand, and learned how to feed the chickens and gather their eggs without startling them. She learned to mend the thick canvas of Caleb's work shirts, her stitches small and neat, a silent act of care he never acknowledged. She learned the rhythms of the land, the way the wind whispered through the tall prairie grass before a storm, the sharp, clean smell of pine from the mountains that framed the valley. The isolation, which had at first felt like a sanctuary, began to wear on her, fraying the edges of her composure. Some days, the loneliness was a vast, empty room inside her, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. Yet, in this stark existence, she found unexpected moments of solace. There was a gentle mare in the corral, old and sway-backed, who would rest her head on Lily's shoulder and let her whisper secrets into her twitching ear. She found comfort in the wordless companionship of the animals, in their simple, honest needs, and she found a strange sense of peace in the landscape itself. Standing at the edge of the porch, looking out at the endless expanse of earth and sky, she felt small, but not insignificant. The mountains stood as silent, powerful sentinels, their peaks capped with snow even in the warmer months. They had witnessed centuries of struggle and survival, and their steadfast presence gave her a sliver of strength here, in the face of such raw, untamed beauty. Her own past felt a little less monumental, a little less all-consuming. Caleb, a man who prided himself on his lack of sentiment, found himself watching her. He did it from a distance, from the corner of his eye, when he thought she was not aware of his gaze. He had hired a wife for appearances, a simple cog for the machinery of his plan to keep his land. He had expected a woman who was either coarse and desperate or timid and broken. Lily was neither. There was a quiet determination in the way she went about her tasks, a resilience that puzzled him. She never complained about the harshness of the work or the profound isolation. She simply did what needed to be done, her movements efficient and graceful. He started noticing the small things, the subtle signs of a past she never spoke of. He saw the way she would flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders, when a log shifted too loudly in the fireplace or when he dropped a tool in the barn. It was the reaction of someone who had learned to expect a blow. He noticed that she never initiated a trip to town, and when he told her they needed supplies, a shadow would pass over her face. She would agree with a quiet nod, but her hands would fidget with the fabric of her apron. In town, she kept her eyes down, her body held stiffly, as if she were walking through a field of hidden traps. And she never, ever spoke of her family. When he had asked her once, a blunt, artless question about where she was from, she had simply said, "A small town in the east," and her voice had become so devoid of emotion that it was like a door slamming shut. He had not asked again. He had built his own life on a foundation of buried grief and sealed-off memories. And he recognized the architecture of her silence. It was a fortress, just like his. He saw the flicker of old pain in her eyes, a deep, sorrowful well that she kept carefully covered. He told himself it was not his concern. Theirs was a business arrangement. Her past was her own affair. but the observations collected in his mind like burrs on a saddle blanket, clinging and persistent. The storm came in late autumn, rolling down from the mountains with a sudden, violent fury. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and the wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, rattling the window panes in their frames. Rain came down in solid, driving sheets, turning the world outside into a gray, blurred chaos. Lily had always been unnerved by storms, but this one felt different, more personal, as if the sky itself were in a rage. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the assault on the house. The log walls groaned under the strain, and the roof seemed to lift with each powerful gust. She pulled the quilt tighter around her, trying to block out the noise, but it was impossible. The storm was inside the room with her. Suddenly, there was a sound unlike the others, a sharp, splintering crack from directly above her, followed by a deafening crash. A massive roof rafter, weakened by rot and battered by the wind, had snapped. It plummeted downwards, landing with a sickening thud on the floor right beside her bed, shattering the floorboards and missing her by inches. Dust and splinters filled the air. Lily screamed, a raw, terrified sound that was torn from the very depths of her soul. She scrambled back against the headboard, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it would break. The door to her room burst open. Caleb stood there, silhouetted by the lamp he held, his face a mask of alarm. He had been woken by the crash, his first thought that the entire roof was coming down. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene in an instant. The shattered rafter, the gaping hole in the ceiling where rain was now pouring in, and Lily, huddled on the bed, trembling so violently he could see it from the doorway. His first instinct was practical, gruff. He should assess the damage, curse the shoddy work of the men who had built the addition years ago. He should tell her to get out of the way so he could deal with the problem. But the sound of her ragged, panicked breathing stopped him. In the flickering lamplight, her face was stark white, her eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond the simple fear of a falling piece of wood. This was something deeper, something older. He saw the woman, not the contractual wife. He saw her fragility, her utter aloneness in this violent night. The gruff words died in his throat. He set the lamp down on the dresser and walked over to the bed. He did not speak. He simply reached out, took the quilt that was clutched in her white-knuckled hands, and wrapped it more securely around her trembling shoulders. Then, to his own profound surprise, he sat down on the edge of the bed, his back to her, creating a solid, physical barrier between her and the wreckage. He did not touch her again. He just sat there, a silent, immovable presence in the chaotic room. He could feel her ragged breath slowly begin to even out. He could hear the storm raging outside, the rain drumming on the roof, the wind howling its mournful song. But inside the small circle of lamplight, a different kind of quiet settled. It was not the empty, lonely silence of their shared meals. It was a silence of witness, of shared vulnerability. He stayed there for a long time, until the worst of the storm had passed and the only sound was the steady drip of water onto the floor. In Blackwood Creek, the storm of gossip raged on, unabated by the weather. Lily's presence was a constant source of speculation, and the stories grew more lurid with each telling. The fact that she so rarely came to town was seen not as a sign of shyness, but of guilt. "She's hiding something, I tell you," Martha Gable declared to a captive audience in the general store. "A decent woman would want to join the church sewing circle, make friends. She stays out on that ranch like a prisoner, or a ghost." "My Billy was out near the Sutton place last week," another woman added, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "He said he saw her talking to a horse, just whispering away like it was a person. It ain't natural." At the saloon, the theories were less charitable. Sadie, the redhead, had decided on a narrative, and she was sticking to it. "She's a runaway. I'd bet my last dollar on it. Probably one of those fancy women from a city brothel who got into some kind of trouble. You can see it in her eyes. She's no innocent. The other girls nodded in agreement, their sneers sharp with a mixture of jealousy and contempt. When Lily did have to walk down the main street on her way to the store, they would fall silent as she passed, their eyes following her with a cold, dismissive appraisal that made her skin crawl. Some even claimed she had bewitched Caleb, casting some kind of Eastern spell on the lonely rancher to get her hands on his land. The truth that their marriage was a cold, practical arrangement was far too boring to be believed. The annual Founders' Day dinner was approaching, a mandatory social event for anyone of any standing in the community. Caleb dreaded it, but he knew they had to go. His cousin Bartholomew would be there, his eyes like a hawk's, searching for any crack in the facade of their marriage. To miss the dinner would be to admit that something was wrong. "We have to go," he told Lily one evening, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It is expected." A flicker of fear crossed her face before she masked it. "Of course," she said, her voice a placid, agreeable monotone. For the occasion, she wore one of the 2 dresses she had brought with her. It was a simple, high-necked gown of dark blue wool, modest and unadorned. But it fit her slender frame perfectly and brought out the deep, violet flecks in her gray eyes. With her honey-colored hair swept up in a neat chignon, she looked elegant and refined, a stark contrast to the more garishly dressed women of the town. When Caleb saw her, a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirred in his chest. It was a flicker of pride. She did not look like a woman bought and paid for. She looked like a lady. The town hall was crowded and noisy, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and cheap perfume. They were an immediate spectacle. Every eye was on them as they entered, and a wave of whispers followed in their wake. Caleb kept a firm hand on the small of Lily's back, guiding her through the throng. The gesture was meant for show, a signal to the town that she was his. But the warmth of her through the thin wool of her dress was a startling, intimate reality. He led her to a table where Mayor Thompson and his wife, a formidable woman named Beatrice, were holding court. Beatrice Thompson's smile was as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. "Caleb, a pleasure to see you," she said, her eyes sliding past him to fix on Lily. She looked her up and down, a slow, insulting appraisal. "And this must be the new Mrs. Sutton." "A pretty girl," she commented, her voice carrying so that those at the neighboring tables could hear. "But I hear she's got secrets." The words, though spoken with a veneer of social pleasantry, landed like a slap in the face. Lily froze, the color draining from her cheeks. Caleb felt her stiffen under his hand. His own face hardened into a dangerous mask of fury. He opened his mouth to deliver a scathing retort, to put Beatrice Thompson in her place. But Lily moved first. She pulled away from him gently, her face a pale, composed mask that betrayed none of the turmoil he knew she must be feeling. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice impossibly steady. "I need some air." She turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She did not run, she simply exited, with a dignity that made the mayor's wife look small and cruel. Caleb watched her go, a war of emotions raging inside him. He wanted to follow her, but he also wanted to stay and tear a strip off Beatrice's hide. He settled for a look, a cold, silent promise of retribution that made the woman's fake smile falter. Then he turned and followed his wife. He didn't find her outside. He scanned the moonlit street, but she was gone. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He strode towards the livery stable, where he had left their buckboard. As he drew near, he heard a sound, a soft, choked sob, quickly stifled. He pushed the large barn door open a few inches and peered into the darkness. He saw her. She was huddled in an empty stall, her back pressed against the rough-hewn wood, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking with silent, racking sobs. The sight of her, so completely broken and alone, struck him with the force of a physical blow. The proud, composed woman from the dinner was gone, replaced by this small, wounded creature. He stepped inside, the door groaning on its hinges. She looked up, startled, her face streaked with tears in the dim moonlight that filtered through the hayloft. She scrambled to her feet, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, a desperate attempt to regain her composure. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I will be ready to go in a moment." Caleb stood there, rooted to the spot. He was a man of action, a man who could solve problems with his hands, with his strength, with his will, but he had no words for this. The language of comfort was foreign to him. He could not offer platitudes about cruel women and town gossip. They would sound hollow and meaningless. He saw the depth of her hurt, and he knew it was not just about Beatrice Thompson's petty cruelty. It was about all the cruelties she had ever endured, all the secrets she was forced to carry. So he said nothing. He simply walked over to the other side of the stall and leaned against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not look at her, but his presence filled the small space. He just stayed near, a silent guardian in the shadows. He was offering the only thing he knew how to give, his steadfast, unwavering presence. They returned to the ranch in a heavy, suffocating silence. Lily went straight to her room and closed the door. Caleb sat in the main room, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The image of her tear-streaked face burned into his mind. He felt a raw, unfamiliar anger. At the town, at himself for putting her in that position, at the past that had so clearly wounded her. Hours later, long after the fire had burned down to ash, he heard a sound, a soft, hesitant knock on his bedroom door. He stood, his heart giving a strange, heavy thump. He opened the door. Lily stood there, a silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. She had taken down her hair, and it fell in a soft, dark honey wave over her shoulders. She was wearing a simple, worn cotton nightgown, her feet bare on the cold wooden floor. She looked young and terribly vulnerable. She clutched her hands together in front of her, her gaze fixed on the floor. Mr. Sutton," she began, her voice a fragile whisper. I know our arrangement." She took a shaky breath. "I am not asking you to break it. She finally lifted her eyes to his, and he saw the profound, aching loneliness in them. "I cannot bear to be alone right now. Will you just hold me?" The request was so simple, so raw, it disarmed him completely. This was not a wife asking for affection. This was a soul in pain asking for a moment of human warmth. It was a plea he found he could not deny. He stepped back, allowing her to enter his room. He closed the door, shutting out the rest of the house, the rest of the world. She stood in the center of the room, looking small and lost. He walked over to her and, with a hesitation that felt profound, he put his arms around her. He was stiff at first, his muscles rigid with uncertainty. Her body was tense, her shoulders trembling slightly. But then she leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, and he felt a small, shuddering sigh escape her lips. Her scent, something clean and simple like lavender and rain, filled his senses. He slowly relaxed his hold, pulling her closer, his large hand resting on the small of her back. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart begin to slow, matching the steady rhythm of his own. Neither of them spoke. There were no words that could bridge the chasm between them, no words that could heal the wounds they both carried, but in the deep, profound silence of the room, with only the sound of their breathing to mark the passage of time, something shifted. He held her, and she let herself be held. The silence was heavier, more meaningful than any words they could have spoken. It was an admission of shared brokenness, a silent acknowledgement of a loneliness that, for a single, fleeting moment, they did not have to bear alone. The night he held her, a fragile truce settled over the ranch. It was not spoken of. The next morning, and in the days that followed, the rigid boundaries of their arrangement were back in place, but the space between them no longer felt so cold, so empty, Something had been acknowledged in the darkness, a shared humanity that could not be entirely dismissed by the light of day. Caleb found himself seeing Lily not as the solution to a legal problem, but as a woman who made the Stark cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a home. The scent of baking bread now greeted him when he came in from the fields. A small jar of wildflowers, plucked from the prairie, sometimes sat on the mantel. These were small things, but in the vast emptiness of his life, they were monumental. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the last light fade from the sky, a flock of birds flew overhead, their calls sharp and clear in the twilight air. Lily watched them, a wistful expression on her face. "My mother had a garden," she said, her voice soft and distant, as if speaking to herself. It was a small, messy thing, crowded with herbs and climbing roses. She said it was the one place where she could make something beautiful grow with her own hands. No matter what else was happening in the world, she fell silent, a curtain drawing back over the brief window into her past. Caleb said nothing, but he filed the words away. A few days later, he began to work. He chose a patch of earth on the sunny, sheltered side of the cabin, a place protected from the harshest winds. He spent 2 full days turning the stubborn, rocky soil, his back and shoulders straining with the effort. He broke up the clods of earth with a hoe, his hands, already calloused, blistering and then healing over again. He hauled rocks away in a wheelbarrow, his sweat soaking through his shirt and staining the dark fabric. He was building something. It was work he understood, a language he was fluent in. When he was finished, he had created a neat, rectangular plot of rich, dark earth, fenced off with thin lengths of aspen wood to keep out the deer and rabbits. He had even built a small wooden gate with a simple latch. He did not present it to her with any fanfare. He simply left it there. Lily discovered it the next morning. She stood before the small, empty garden for a long time, her hand resting on the top of the little gate. It was a patch of dirt. It was a promise. It was a silent apology for a world that had been unkind to her. She did not thank him. She knew he would be uncomfortable with that. But that evening, when she served him his dinner, her hand brushed against his as she set down his plate, and she let it linger for a single, breathtaking second. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, and in its own way, it was thanks enough. That night, Lily unlatched her worn leather bag and took out a small, cloth-bound journal and a pen. It was a gift from her father, from a time before the silence, before the shame. She had not written in it for over a year. The blank pages had seemed to mock her, a testament to a life that was too painful to record. But now, sitting in the quiet of her room, the scent of freshly turned earth drifting in through the open window, she felt an urge to fill them. She dipped the pen in the small pot of ink she had carefully carried with her from the east. October 12th, she wrote, her handwriting shaky at first, then growing steadier. He built a garden for me. He did not say a word about it, but it is there, waiting. Sometimes, his silence is the kindest sound I have ever heard. I have begun to feel a strange sort of peace in this place. The mountains do not judge, and the wind does not whisper lies. It is possible, I think, to be lonely without being wretched. It is a distinction I am only now beginning to understand. She began to write every few days, pouring out the thoughts she could not speak. The journal became her confidant, the only place where she could be truly honest. Her entries chronicled the quiet, internal war she was fighting. October 18th, she wrote, I find myself watching him when he is unaware. There is a gentleness in the way he handles a newborn calf, a strength in his shoulders that makes me feel safe. I feel a longing that frightens me. It is a foolish, dangerous thing to wish for more than the terms of our agreement. He bought a wife to secure his land, not to unburden his heart. What would he do if he knew the truth of me? If he knew the ugliness I carry? I fear he would look at me with the same disgust I have seen in so many other eyes. The safety I feel here is built upon a lie, and I do not know how long it can stand. while a fragile peace was taking root at the ranch. Caleb's cousin, Bartholomew Sutton, was growing impatient. The deadline stipulated in the will was fast approaching, and Caleb, the stubborn recluse, had unexpectedly met the terms. Bartholomew, a man whose ambition far outstripped his abilities, was not convinced. He saw the sudden marriage for what it was, a desperate, last-minute maneuver, and he was determined to expose it as a fraud. He hired 2 men, rough-looking characters who drifted from town to town, their services available to anyone with enough coin. He gave them simple instructions: go to Blackwood Creek, ask questions about Caleb's new wife, and find out where she came from. Find some dirt. Bartholomew was certain that a woman who would agree to such a marriage must have a past she was eager to hide. The men arrived in town and began their work in the most fertile ground for such an endeavor, the saloon and the general store. They bought rounds of whiskey, their questions casual at first, then growing more pointed. "So, that rancher, Sutton," one of them said to Sadie, the redhead, as he slid a coin across the bar. "Heard he finally got himself hitched. Must be some woman to tame that one." Sadie tossed her hair, flattered by the attention. "Her?" she scoffed. "Some pale little thing from back east. No one knows a thing about her. Keeps to herself, if you ask me. She's got the look of a woman who's seen the inside of a courtroom, or worse." In the general store, the other man made inquiries of Martha Gable while pretending to inspect a barrel of pickles. "My wife is always looking for new folks to join the church social," he lied smoothly. "This Mrs. Sutton, do you know which parish she attended back home? We'd like to send a letter of welcome." Martha Gable, who considered herself the town's foremost authority on all matters social and moral, puffed up with importance. "No one knows. It's all very mysterious. She arrived with a single bag and no connections. It's highly irregular. I've heard she comes from a place called Northwood. But when my cousin wrote to a friend there, no one had ever heard of a Lily Hart." The men gathered the whispers, the speculations, the outright lies. They pieced together a caricature of Lily, a woman who was a ghost, a seductress, a criminal. They sent a telegram to Bartholomew, detailing the rumors. It was not proof of anything, but it was enough to fuel his suspicion. He wrote a letter, an anonymous one, compiling the most venomous of the rumors into a single, poisonous dart, and he paid a traveler to see that it was delivered to the Sutton Ranch. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Lily found it slipped under the front door when she went out to fetch water in the morning. It was a single, folded sheet of paper, with no name on it. She picked it up, a sense of foreboding washing over her. She took it inside and placed it on the large table in the main room. Caleb came in for the midday meal, and his eyes immediately fell on the letter. "What is this?" he asked. "I do not know. It was under the door," Lily replied, her voice barely a whisper. He picked it up and unfolded it. As he read, she watched the color drain from his face. She saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped the paper. She saw his jaw tighten, and a cold, hard stillness settle over him. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were like chips of ice. The warmth that had begun to grow between them, the fragile trust, was gone. In its place was a cold, piercing suspicion. He placed the letter on the table between them. "It says here," he began, his voice low and dangerous, "that my wife is not who she claims to be. It says she was cast out of her hometown. It says she was accused of seducing the pastor's son. It says her name is not Lily Hart, but Lilith, a name her own father disowned." Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile life she had begun to build. She stared at the letter, at the cruel, twisted version of her past laid bare on the page. She felt the blood rush from her head, the room tilting around her. "Is it true?" Caleb demanded, his voice cutting through her daze. "Did you lie to me?" Lily sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart crumbled to dust. The composure she had worn like a suit of armor fell away. leaving her utterly exposed. A great shuddering sob broke from her lips, a sound of such profound, gut-wrenching despair that it made Caleb take an involuntary step back. "The lies are not mine," she choked out, the words torn from her throat. "The lies were theirs." And then it all came pouring out, a torrent of pain and humiliation that had been dammed up for too long. She told him everything. She told him about the pastor's son, a boy named Thomas, who had cornered her in the alley behind her father's shop, his breath sour with whiskey. She told him how she had fought, how she had scratched and kicked and screamed until he finally let her go. But not before he had torn her dress and left his brutal marks on her skin. "I told my father," she wept, her face buried in her hands. "I told him what happened. He went to the pastor, demanding justice." She looked up at Caleb then, her eyes swimming with a grief so deep it seemed bottomless. The pastor did not believe him. Thomas was his golden boy, his precious son. He claimed I had tempted the boy, that I had led him astray with my wicked ways. They called me a liar, a seductress. She took a ragged breath, the memory still raw, still bleeding. "The whole town turned against us. No one would buy from my father's shop. Old friends crossed the street to avoid me. The whispers followed me everywhere. They called me Lilith, the name of a demon, until I started to believe it myself. My father grew to hate the sight of me. He said I had brought shame upon his house. He told me to leave. So I ran. I forged the letter from the minister. I changed my name. I thought if I ran far enough, I could outrun the lies." She fell silent, her story finished. The only sound in the room was the sound of her own ragged, painful breathing. She looked at Caleb, searching his face for some sign of understanding, of compassion. But his expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. He was shaken, not by the story itself, but by the raw, brutal force of her pain. He was a builder, a breaker of horses, a man of fences and fields. He did not know how to be a harbor. He did not know how to comfort this woman who was drowning in front of him. His silence was her answer. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of the pastor, in the eyes of the townspeople, in the eyes of her own father. It was the look of judgment, of condemnation. She had shown him the ugliest, most broken part of herself, and he was disgusted. The last, tiny ember of hope in her heart turned to ash. Slowly, shakily, she rose to her feet. "I see," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I will pack my things. I will be gone by morning." She turned and walked towards her room, each step an agony. She had been a fool to think this place could be a home, a fool to think this man could be different. Caleb watched her go, a war raging inside him. He felt a white-hot anger at the injustice of her story, at the town that had so cruelly cast her out. He felt a profound, suffocating guilt for his own coldness, for the way he had confronted her, for the hard silence that she had so clearly misinterpreted. And he felt anger at her, a confusing, irrational anger that she had not trusted him with the truth from the beginning. He was suffocating, drowning in emotions he did not know how to name. He turned and strode out of the house, grabbing the reins of his horse. He needed to move. He needed the wind in his face, the hard rhythm of the horse beneath him. He galloped out onto the plains, riding hard and fast, as if he could outrun the turmoil in his own heart. Lily moved through her room in a daze, pulling her few belongings from the dresser and folding them into her bag. The garden outside her window seemed to mock her, a symbol of a hope that had been foolishly planted and had now withered and died. She was halfway through her packing when a knock came at the front door. Not Caleb's hard, impatient knock, but something more hesitant. Wiping her eyes, she went to the door. It was an older man, a neighboring rancher named Jedediah, who had always been civil to Caleb. He held his hat in his hands, his face etched with concern. "Mrs. Sutton," he said, his eyes kind. "I don't mean to intrude, but I saw Caleb ride out of here like the devil himself was on his tail. And, Well, I saw two strangers leaving your road not long before that. Rough-looking men. They were in town a few days ago, asking questions about you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I know it's not my place, ma'am, but I also know that Bartholomew Sutton is a snake. I heard he's telling folks around town that he'll have this land one way or another by the end of the month. He's not a man to play by the rules when he's losing. I'm just saying, be careful. Your husband has enemies." He tipped his hat and left, leaving Lily standing in the doorway, his words echoing in the silence. Her first instinct was to finish packing, to run faster and farther than she ever had before. But then something shifted inside her. She looked at the bag on her bed, a symbol of her life of fleeing. She looked around the simple, solid house that had, against all odds, started to feel like a home. She thought of Caleb's rough, unexpected kindness. She thought of the garden. A slow, burning anger began to replace her despair. She had spent her life running from the cruelty of others. She had let lies and whispers chase her across a continent. She would not run anymore. This land, this house, this fragile, complicated life, it was hers, bought with her signature and paid for with her dignity. She would not let another grasping, cruel man take something from her. She walked to the front door and slid the heavy wooden latch into place. It was a small sound, a simple click of wood against wood, but it felt like a declaration of war. She would stay. She would fight. This time, she would not disappear. Caleb rode until the lather on his horse matched the foam of his own rage and confusion. He pushed the animal hard across the plains, the rhythmic thunder of its hooves a desperate drumbeat against the silence of his thoughts. The wind whipped at his face, a cold, sharp slap that did little to clear the storm inside him. He had fled the cabin, fled the sight of Lily's shattered face, fled the raw, agonizing story that now lay between them like a drawn knife. He was a man who understood simple truths: land, weather, the life and death of livestock. The tangled, ugly mess of human cruelty was a territory he had long ago abandoned. Her story dredged it all up again. The remembered sting of betrayal, the hollow ache of a trust broken. But what he felt was not the clean, simple anger of being deceived. It was a murky, churning torrent of emotions he could not name. He felt a searing rage at the faceless, pious men who had branded her, who had stolen her name and her voice. He felt a profound, suffocating guilt for the coldness of his own interrogation, for the way he had held that poisonous letter and demanded the truth as if he were a judge and she a criminal. He had looked at her with suspicion, and in doing so, had become one of them. The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. He rode until the horse was spent and the sun began to dip towards the jagged teeth of the mountains. He stopped by a small creek, letting the horse drink as he stared into the darkening landscape. He had built his world on the principle of needing no one, of trusting nothing that could not be held in his hands. He had hired a wife as one might hire a fence mender for a specific, unemotional purpose, but it was not a signature on a document that he had brought into his home. It was a woman who had endured a crucifixion of whispers and had somehow, impossibly, maintained her grace. As he rode back, a slow dread cooled his anger. He expected an empty house. He deserved an empty house. The silence that would greet him would be a just punishment for the silence he had given her when she had needed a voice of comfort most. He imagined her room, the bed stripped, the small bag she had arrived with gone. He had offered her shelter, and he had made it unsafe. He had offered her protection, and he had been the one to wound her. He rode the last mile with a heavy, resigned heart, preparing himself for the loneliness he had so carefully cultivated, a loneliness that now felt like a curse. The cabin was dark, save for a single lamp burning in the main room. He swung down from his horse, his body aching with fatigue, and pushed the door open. The air was still. He saw her bag, sitting on the floor by the door, half-packed. His heart sank. He had been right. She was leaving. Then he saw her. She was not in her room. She was sitting at the large table, her hands folded in front of her, the lamplight casting a soft glow on her determined face. She was not crying. Her eyes, when she lifted them to meet his, were clear and steady. There was no fear in them, only a strength he had never seen before. "I am not going," she said, her voice quiet but firm, resonating in the still air. Caleb stood in the doorway, the dust of his long ride still on him, his confusion palpable. "Your bag," he began, his voice hoarse. "I started to pack," she admitted. "It is what I have always done. When things became unbearable, I ran from the whispers, from the looks, from the shame. I ran until I had nowhere left to run but here." She stood up, her small frame seeming to possess an unshakable solidity. "But a man came to the door after you left, a neighbor. He said your cousin has sent men to ask questions about me. He said your cousin will not stop until he has this land." I realized then that running is not freedom. It is just a different kind of cage. Every time I run, I let them win. I let them erase me. She took a step towards him, her gaze unwavering. "I am tired of being silent. I am tired of hiding. I will not let your cousin, or the ghosts of a town 1,000 miles from here, chase me out of this house." A fire kindled in her eyes, a defiant flame that burned away the last traces of the victim he had seen that afternoon. "I will not disappear this time. Caleb," her using his first name, the fierce ownership in her voice, the raw courage of her standing there, refusing to be broken, it all coalesced inside him, breaking through the walls he had spent years building. The anger, the guilt, the strange, protective tenderness he felt for her, it all surged into a single, overwhelming wave of emotion. He did not think, he only acted. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. He cupped her face in his rough, calloused hands, his thumbs stroking the soft skin of her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, seeing not her past, not her secrets, but the incredible, unbreakable strength of the woman standing before him. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss, it was a kiss of raw, unrestrained emotion, a collision of 2 lonely, wounded souls. It was harsh and desperate, a release of all the unspoken tension that had simmered between them for weeks. It was his apology, his acknowledgement, his plea, all communicated in a language that required no words. For a moment, she was stiff with surprise, and then she melted against him, her hands coming up to grip his arms. She kissed him back with an equal, startling fire, a ferocity that matched his own. It was the kiss of a woman who had been starved of tenderness, of a woman who was finally, defiantly, claiming her own desire. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts hammering in the charged silence of the room. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Lily," he breathed, her real name a prayer on his lips. That night, the sky broke open. A storm, even more violent than the one that had broken the rafter, swept through the valley. Rain pounded against the roof like a frantic drumbeat, and the wind howled a wild, keening song. They ate their dinner in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a vibrant, palpable tension. Every accidental brush of their hands, every shared glance across the table, was a spark in the darkness. Later, as the storm raged, he sat by the fire, pretending to read a book, though the words on the page were a meaningless blur. He heard the soft creak of her door, the whisper of her bare feet on the wooden floor. He looked up. She stood just outside the circle of firelight, her hair down, wearing the same simple nightgown she had worn the night he had held her. But this time, there was no fear in her eyes, no desperate plea for comfort. There was only a quiet, resolute calm. She walked towards him, the firelight dancing on her face, and stopped before him. She looked into his eyes, a long, searching look that stripped away all pretense, all bargains, all formal arrangements. "Caleb," she said, her voice a soft murmur beneath the roar of the storm. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its heavy, steady beat. "You can undress me for real tonight." The words hung in the air between them. Simple, profound, and utterly terrifying in their vulnerability. It was not a seduction. It was not an invitation to slake a physical desire. It was a declaration of trust. It was an offering of the person she was beneath the scars, beneath the shame, beneath the lies that had been told about her. It was a statement that she was no longer a ghost, no longer a placeholder wife. She was a woman, real and whole, and she was choosing to show him all of it. He stood, his hand covering hers on his chest. He led her by the hand to his room, the room she had never entered, and closed the door, shutting out the storm. The only light was from the moon, a sliver of silver that cut through a break in the clouds. Their union was a slow, aching revelation. Every touch was a question, every response an answer. He undressed her with a reverence that bordered on worship, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he revealed the pale, luminous skin beneath her worn nightgown. When his fingers brushed against the raised, rough network of scars on her side, she flinched, not from pain, but from memory. He paused, and in the dim light, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to them, a silent act of acceptance that made her gasp, a soft, broken sound. She trembled in his arms, but it was not the trembling of fear. It was the shuddering release of a soul that had been held captive for too long. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of absolution. He was gentle, so gentle, as if he were holding something infinitely precious, something he was terrified of breaking. He murmured her name against her skin, over and over, erasing the ugly name the world had tried to give her. For the first time in her life, she felt not shame in her body, but a profound, powerful beauty. For the first time in his life, Caleb understood that true strength was not in building walls, but in having the courage to let them fall. They woke the next morning to a world washed clean by the storm. The sun streamed through the window, bright and clear. They were tangled in the blankets, her head on his chest, his arm wrapped securely around her. For a long while, they simply lay there, listening to the sound of each other's breathing. A silent understanding had been forged in the crucible of the night. The arrangement was over. The contract was void. Whatever this new fragile thing was between them, it was real. The sound of horses and a carriage rattling up the path to the cabin broke the morning's peace. Caleb rose, dressed quickly, and looked out the window. His face hardened. "It's Bartholomew," he said, his voice a low growl. "And he's brought the sheriff with him." Lily dressed, her hands moving with a newfound steadiness. When Caleb opened the front door, she was standing right beside him, not behind him. Bartholomew Sutton stepped out of the carriage, a smug, triumphant look on his fleshy face. He held a sheaf of legal papers in his hand. "Caleb," he said, his voice oozing false sympathy. "Sheriff Brody, I'm afraid we have a legal matter to attend to." "Get off my land, Bartholomew," Caleb said, his voice flat and cold. "Your land?" Bartholomew chuckled. "That's the matter at hand. I have here a formal petition to the court, questioning the validity of this marriage." He gestured dismissively towards Lily. "It is clearly a sham, a fraudulent attempt to circumvent the terms of our father's will. This woman appeared out of nowhere. No one knows a thing about her. The marriage was performed in haste, without banns or celebration. It is a mockery of the sacred institution, and I will not see our family legacy stolen by such a transparent trick." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Caleb, he has a right to file the petition. The judge will have to look into it." Before Caleb could respond, Lily stepped forward. "This marriage is no trick," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a conviction that made all three men look at her in surprise. "I am Caleb Sutton's wife." Caleb put his arm around her, pulling her firmly to his side. He looked directly at his cousin, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "This is my wife," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And this is my land. You are not welcome here. Get out." Bartholomew, taken aback by their united front, stammered for a moment before regaining his composure. "This is not over. Caleb, the law will see the truth of this." He climbed back into his carriage, and they rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and unresolved threats hanging in the air. That Sunday, Caleb did something he had not done in 5 years. He hitched the buckboard and drove Lily to church. Their arrival caused a stir that rippled through the congregation. Whispers followed them up the aisle as they took a seat in a pew near the front. Beatrice Thompson shot Lily a look of pure venom. Sadie, the saloon girl, who was there for a rare moment of piety, smirked at her friends. At the end of the service, before the final hymn, Caleb stood up. The minister paused. Surprised, the entire church fell silent. Caleb's voice, when he spoke, was clear and carried to every corner of the small building. "I have something to say," he began, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his neighbors. "Many of you have seen fit to whisper about my wife. You have speculated about her past, and you have passed judgment without knowledge or kindness." His eyes rested for a moment on Beatrice Thompson, who flushed a deep, mottled red. "Let me be clear. Lily Sutton is my wife. Her past is her own, but her present and her future are with me. She is a woman of courage and honor and strength. I am proud to be her husband." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I hired a bride because I was a fool, too proud and too stubborn to admit I needed anyone. But God, in His wisdom, sent me more than I deserved. He sent me a good woman." He looked down at Lily, and the entire congregation saw the raw, unguarded emotion on his face. "From this day forward, anyone who shames my wife shames me. Anyone who insults her insults me. If you cannot find it in your hearts to show her respect, then you are no friend of mine." He sat down. A stunned silence held the church in its grip, followed by a low murmur of conversation. Jedediah, the neighboring rancher, nodded his head in approval. A few other faces softened. For the first time, Lily felt not the sting of their judgment, but the possibility of their acceptance. But Bartholomew would not be stopped. Defeated in his public confrontation, he turned to more insidious methods. He traveled to the territorial capital and hired a lawyer, a man with a reputation for being clever and utterly without scruples. "The marriage is a sham, but they present a united front," Bartholomew explained, pacing the lawyer's dusty office. "We need to prove she is not who she says she is. We need to prove she tricked him." The lawyer steepled his fingers, a sly smile on his thin lips. "Proof can be a difficult thing to find," he said smoothly. "But sometimes, when it cannot be found, it can be created." He began to outline a plan, a web of forged documents and paid witnesses, designed to suggest that Lily Hart had not only lied about her past, but had used illegal means to secure her marriage to a wealthy rancher. The fight for the Sutton Ranch was far from over. It was about to get much, much uglier. The official summons arrived a week later, delivered by a reluctant Sheriff Brody. He stood on their porch, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed somewhere over Caleb's shoulder, unable to meet either of their eyes. The document, filled with dense legal script, commanded Lily's presence at a formal hearing in the town hall to determine the legitimacy of her marriage to Caleb Sutton. It was not a trial in the criminal sense, but it felt like one. She was, once again, being put on display, her character and her past to be publicly dissected and judged. A cold, familiar dread settled in Lily's stomach. She felt the ghosts of Northwood gathering at her back, whispering that a tainted woman could never truly be free, that her shame would follow her no matter how far she ran. Caleb took the paper from the sheriff's hand, his expression hardening into granite. "This is Bartholomew's doing," he said, his voice a low growl. "It has no merit." "Maybe not. Caleb," Sheriff Brody said, finally looking at him, his face weary. "But he hired a slick lawyer from the Capitol. The judge has to hear the petition. My hands are tied. The hearing is set for Friday." He gave Lily a brief, pitying glance, then turned and left, his duty unpleasantly discharged. Caleb crumpled the summons in his fist. "We will fight this," he said, his eyes blazing with a protective fury that was more potent than any declaration. "You will not face them alone." The days leading up to the hearing were thick with a tense, oppressive silence. Lily went about her chores mechanically, her mind 1,000 miles away, replaying the humiliations of her past. Caleb was a constant, solid presence at her side. He spoke little, but his nearness was a comfort, a silent promise that he would not abandon her. He was sharpening his anger, honing it into a weapon he intended to wield in her defense. Friday arrived, a gray, overcast day that mirrored the mood in Lily's heart. The town hall was packed, not a single seat empty. It was a spectacle, and the people of Blackwood Creek had turned out in droves to witness it. Lily walked down the center aisle, her hand tucked into the crook of Caleb's arm, his strength the only thing keeping her knees from buckling. She could feel the weight of their stares, a physical pressure on her skin. She saw Beatrice Thompson, the mayor's wife, sitting in the front row, a look of smug vindication on her face. In a corner near the back, Sadie and the other saloon girls whispered behind their hands, their sneers like open wounds. The hearing began. Bartholomew's lawyer, a man with a thin, cruel mouth and eyes that glittered with professional malice, laid out his case. He painted a picture of Lily as a mysterious, opportunistic woman who had appeared from nowhere to ensnare a wealthy, grieving rancher. He spoke of a marriage conducted in suspicious haste, a bride with no family, no history, no one to speak for her character. He called his first witness, Beatrice Thompson. The mayor's wife took the stand with an air of great self-importance. She spoke of Lily's aloofness, her refusal to integrate into the town's social fabric. "She is a strange woman, secretive," Beatrice declared, her voice ringing with false piety. "She has a darkness about her, not at all the sort of wife a man like Caleb Sutton should have to represent his family's good name." Next, the lawyer called Sadie. The saloon girl sashayed to the stand, enjoying her moment in the spotlight. She recounted the rumors she had so diligently spread, presenting them as fact. "Men in the saloon, travelers, they say she's a runaway," Sadie said, her voice dripping with insinuation. "They say she was run out of her last town for unseemly behavior, with a man of the cloth's son, no less." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Throughout the testimony, Caleb sat rigid. His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He kept his hand over Lily's, a warm, steady anchor in a sea of hostility. He refused to back down, his glare daring anyone in the room to challenge him. Finally, the lawyer rested his case, confident that he had sown enough doubt, enough scandal, to sway the judge. The judge, an old, stern-faced man named Miller, turned his gaze to their table. "Mr. Sutton, does your wife have anything to say in her defense?" This was the moment. Caleb squeezed her hand. "You do not have to do this," he murmured, his voice for her alone. But Lily knew she did. She looked at the hostile faces, at the whispers and the sneers, and she knew that silence was no longer an option. She had spent her life in the shadow of a story told by others. Now, she would tell her own. She rose to her feet and walked to the stand, her steps even and deliberate. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at the judge and then at Caleb, who gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. She took a deep breath, the scent of dust and stale air filling her lungs, and she began to speak. Her voice, at first, was a fragile, trembling thing, barely audible in the silent room. "My name is Lily Hart Sutton," she began. "It is true that I came here from a small town in the east. It is true that I arrived with very little. And it is true that I was hiding a secret." She paused, letting the admission hang in the air. Beatrice Thompson leaned forward, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "But the secret is not what you think," Lily continued, her voice gaining strength, infused with the power of a truth that had been suppressed for too long. "I was not cast out for being a seductress. I was cast out for being a victim." She recounted the story, not with the hysterical tears of that afternoon in the cabin, but with a stark, chilling clarity. She spoke of the pastor's son, of his assault in the alley, of her torn dress and her terror. She spoke of telling her father, of the pastor's denial, of a town that chose to believe the powerful over the powerless. "They called me a liar," she said, her voice ringing with a sorrow that was deeper than anger. "They took my name and replaced it with an ugly one. They took my reputation and tore it to shreds. They shamed me until I began to believe their lies, until I believed that I was the one who was dirty, that I was the one who was wrong. My own father sent me away because he could no longer bear the sight of the shame I had supposedly brought upon him." Tears began to well in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She would not give them her tears. "I came west not to trap a husband or to steal a man's land," she said, her voice rising, passionate and clear. "I came west because I had nowhere else to go. I answered Mr. Sutton's advertisement because it offered something I had not known in a very long time, a place where no one knew my name, a place where I could be left alone. I was not looking for land, or for money, or even for love. I was looking for peace." She finished, her chest heaving. The story, finally, fully told. The courtroom was utterly, profoundly stunned. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of a woman in the back row openly weeping. Some faces in the crowd were etched with shame, others with pity. Some, like Beatrice, merely looked on with cold, unfeeling disbelief. Before the judge could speak, Caleb stood. He walked to the front of the room and stood beside the witness stand, placing a hand on Lily's shoulder. He did not look at the judge. He looked at the people of his town, at the men and women he had known his entire life. "I have a confession of my own to make," he said, his voice raw with an emotion no one in that room had ever heard from him. "What Bartholomew's lawyer says is partially true. This marriage did begin as a sham. I was a bitter, lonely man, haunted by my own past, and I refused to let anyone close to me. So I hired a bride for appearances, to satisfy a clause in a will so I could keep my land." He paused, then turned his gaze fully on Lily, a look of such profound, unguarded tenderness on his face that it silenced the very air in the room. "I hired a bride for appearances," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "But I love the woman who stands here. I love her courage. I love her strength. I love the quiet dignity she has shown in the face of cruelty and judgment. She is more of a wife, more of a partner than I ever deserved. This marriage may have started as a lie to the world, but it has become the truest thing in my life." He looked back at the judge. "That is my testimony." Judge Miller cleared his throat, his own eyes suspiciously bright. He looked at Bartholomew, whose face had turned a pasty, sickly white. "Mr. Sutton," the judge said, his voice gruff, "you have presented a case built on rumor, innuendo, and malice. Mr. and Mrs. Sutton have presented a case built on truth, however painful. This petition is dismissed. This marriage is valid in the eyes of the law and of this court." He banged his gavel, the sound echoing the finality of his words. The legal battle was won, but as they walked out of the town hall, the social one was far from over. Some people nodded to them, their expressions changed, respectful. Jedediah clapped Caleb on the shoulder, but others, including Beatrice and her friends, turned their backs, their faces set in hard, unforgiving lines. The damage was done. They had won their case, but in the eyes of some, Lily would always be the outsider, the woman with a tarnished past. The ride back to the ranch was silent, the emotional exhaustion a heavy blanket over both of them. As Caleb helped her down from the buckboard, Lily's legs gave way. The stress, the fear, the immense, draining effort of laying her soul bare for a hostile crowd, it all came crashing down on her at once. She collapsed, not into unconsciousness, but into a boneless heap of utter depletion. Caleb caught her easily, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He carried her into the house, into his own bedroom, and laid her gently on the bed. She was shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor running through her body. He pulled the quilt over her, his movements gentle and sure. He brought her a glass of water, holding it to her lips. "Rest now," he said softly. He sat in a chair beside the bed for hours, watching over her as she drifted in and out of a fitful sleep. When she finally woke, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the room. He was still there, his patient, steady presence a balm to her frayed nerves. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He leaned forward, taking her hand in his. "I am here," he said. He smoothed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his touch infinitely tender. "You do not have to fight alone anymore. Lily, not ever again." Tears filled her eyes and spilled down her temples into the pillow. "I was so scared," she confessed. "I know," he said. "You were the bravest person in that room today." That night, they did not make love. They talked. For the first time, they talked honestly, with no walls, no secrets. She spoke of the profound loneliness that had been her constant companion, the feeling of being irrevocably broken, unworthy of kindness. He, in turn, spoke of his own grief, the one he had never shared with anyone. He told her of his first love, a woman he had planned to marry, who had betrayed him with his closest friend. He spoke of the deep, lasting wound it had left, the way it had convinced him that love was a trap, a weakness that would inevitably lead to pain. "I built this ranch as a fortress," he admitted, his voice low. "I thought if I kept everyone out, I could not be hurt again." "And now?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a lifetime of unspoken sorrow and a brand new, terrifying hope. "And now, you are inside the walls," he said. "And I am more afraid than I have ever been. Afraid of hurting you. Afraid of what it means to want someone this much." He took a deep breath, the confession costing him more than he had ever admitted. "I used to think love was a weakness, something that made a man soft, that made him vulnerable to the blows of the world." He squeezed her hand, his gaze intense, unwavering. "Now, I think it's what keeps me breathing." The months that followed the hearing were a quiet, healing balm. The harsh winds of winter gave way to the gentle breath of spring, and with the changing of the seasons, a new, tender landscape began to emerge in the space between Caleb and Lily. The rigid lines of their arrangement dissolved completely, replaced by a slow, quiet rhythm of partnership. They worked the ranch together, a team forged not by contract, but by a chosen closeness. Their bond deepened in the small, unspoken moments that stitch a life together. It was in the way he started leaving a bucket of fresh water for her garden on the porch every morning before he rode out, a silent acknowledgement of the small patch of beauty she was coaxing from the stubborn earth. It was in the way she learned the precise strength he liked his coffee, placing the steaming mug in his hand without a word as he came in from the cold. He taught her how to properly ride, not just perch on a horse, but to feel the animal's strength and rhythm as an extension of her own. She, in turn, read to him in the evenings from the book of poems she had brought with her, her soft voice filling the cabin with a gentleness it had never known. They were two people deeply scarred by the world, and they learned to navigate each other's wounds with a careful, intuitive grace. He learned that the scent of whiskey on a man's breath would make her subtly recoil, and he quietly forbade Jake from drinking in the bunkhouse. She learned that on the anniversary of his father's death, a deep, impenetrable melancholy would settle over him, and she would simply ensure the fire was warm and his dinner was ready, offering him the solace of her presence without the burden of questions. Their love was not a grand, declarative fire. It was a slow, steady ember, glowing warmly in the hearth of the home they were building, rooted in the shared soil of their pasts. But the snake that had been driven from their garden had not gone far. Bartholomew Sutton, humiliated in court and consumed by a festering, obsessive greed, watched them from a distance. He saw the genuine partnership, the quiet contentment. The life he felt had been stolen from him. His legal options were exhausted. His reputation in town was tarnished, and his desperation curdled into a dark, destructive rage. If he could not have the land, then neither would Caleb. The attack came on a moonless night in the heat of late summer. A strange, acrid smell woke Lily from a deep sleep. She sat up, her heart beginning to pound, and saw a hellish orange light flickering against her window pane. Smoke. A thick, choking cloud of it was already beginning to seep under her bedroom door. "Caleb!" she screamed, leaping from the bed. He was already moving, his door bursting open as he met her in the hallway. The smell was stronger now, the horrifying crackle of hungry flames audible from the direction of the barn. "Stay in the house," he commanded, his face a grim mask in the eerie, dancing light. He grabbed the heavy rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace and ran out into the night. Lily, however, did not obey. The woman who would have once hidden, trembling, was gone. She pulled on her boots, her hands shaking but her mind clear. She ran to the kitchen and grabbed the largest bucket, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Caleb's life, their life, was in that barn. The horses, the winter hay, the tools that were the very instruments of their survival. When she got outside, the scene was a nightmare. The great barn was engulfed in flames, a monstrous, roaring bonfire that lit up the entire valley, sparks flying up to join the stars. And in the terrible, flickering light, she saw two figures struggling near the corral. It was Caleb and Bartholomew. Her cousin was a man possessed, his face contorted with a mad, triumphant glee. He held a flaming torch, swinging it wildly as Caleb tried to wrestle it from him. "It is all going to burn, Caleb!" Bartholomew shrieked, his voice thin and crazed. "All of it. If it cannot be mine, it will be ash." Caleb, armed with the rifle, was trying to subdue him without shooting him, using the heavy stock of the gun to parry the flaming torch. But Bartholomew was fueled by a madman's strength. He brought the torch down in a vicious arc, catching Caleb across the shoulder. Caleb cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain as his sleeve caught fire. He dropped the rifle to beat out the flames on his arm. And in that moment of distraction, Bartholomew lunged, driving a long, wicked-looking knife into Caleb's side. Caleb staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, his hand going to the wound where a dark stain was already spreading across his shirt. Lily saw it all in a horrifying, slow-motion tableau. She saw the rifle lying in the dust. She saw the crazed look in Bartholomew's eyes as he raised the knife again for another strike. She saw Caleb, wounded and stumbling, unable to defend himself. A cold, absolute certainty moved through her. She ran. She scooped up the heavy rifle, the wood smooth and cool against her frantic hands. She had never fired a gun in her life, but Caleb had shown her how to load it, how it worked. She lifted the barrel, its weight unfamiliar and terrifying. She did not aim for his head or his heart. She aimed for the ground at his feet. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The kick of the rifle so powerful it nearly knocked her off her feet. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt right in front of Bartholomew's boots. He froze, his arm still raised, his head whipping around to stare at her. In his eyes, she was no longer the pale, quiet woman he had dismissed. In the firelight, with the rifle in her hands, she was a figure of righteous fury, an avenging angel of the home he had tried to destroy. The madness in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden, primal fear. The gunshot, loud and sharp in the night air, was a signal. From the bunkhouse, Jake came running, and from the next ridge over, the telltale lantern of Jedediah's wagon began to bob and weave as he raced towards the fire. The spell was broken. Bartholomew dropped the knife and the torch and made a desperate run for the darkness. But Jake, young and fast, tackled him to the ground. By the time Sheriff Brody arrived, summoned by Jedediah, the fire was beginning to die down, though the barn was a smoldering, blackened skeleton against the first gray light of dawn. Bartholomew was tied up, whimpering and incoherent, and Caleb was lying on the ground near the porch, Lily kneeling beside him, pressing a torn piece of her own dress against the wound in his side, her face pale but her hands steady. The sheriff took in the scene: the destroyed barn, the captured cousin, the wounded husband, and the wife with gunpowder smudges on her cheek and a rifle resting on the ground beside her. He looked at Lily, at her fierce, protective posture over her husband, and for the first time, he saw her not as a mysterious outsider, but as the formidable woman Caleb had claimed she was. He slowly, deliberately, removed his hat and tipped it to her. It was a simple gesture, but it was a profound sign of respect, an acknowledgement of her strength that echoed through the quiet morning air. Caleb's wound was deep, but not fatal. The doctor from town stitched him up, warning him that he would be weak for some time and would need to stay in bed. The days that followed were a quiet testament to the depth of their new reality. Lily became his nurse, his caregiver, his constant shadow. She changed his bandages, cooked him broth, and sat by his bedside, her presence a quiet, unwavering comfort. One afternoon, as he lay weak and pale against the pillows, she did something she had never imagined she would do. She retrieved her cloth-bound journal from her room. Her heart hammered with a vulnerability that was even more terrifying than facing down Bartholomew. "Caleb," she said softly, sitting in the chair beside his bed, "there is something I want you to hear." She opened the journal, its pages filled with her neat, careful script. "I started writing again after you built the garden," she confessed, her cheeks flushing. "I wrote down things I was too afraid to say." She began to read. She read the entry about the garden, about his kindness. She read about her fear of her own growing feelings for him, her certainty that he would reject her if he knew her past. Her voice was soft, trembling at first, then growing stronger as she read the words that chronicled her heart's secret journey. She read an entry from the week before the hearing. "He stood by me today. He did not flinch from the ugliness of my past. In his eyes, I see not a broken thing, but a woman. I am beginning to believe that I am not the sum of what was done to me. I am the sum of the choices I make now, and I choose to love this quiet, wounded man. I do not know if he will ever love me in return, but my heart, it seems, has made its choice without my permission." Finally, she read the entry from the night of the fire, written just hours before it happened. "Tonight, I feel a sense of peace so profound, it feels like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. To be loved by him is to be seen, truly seen. For the first time, the arrangement we made seems like a lifetime ago. He was hiring a bride, and I was seeking a sanctuary. I think, perhaps, we both found what we were looking for, and so much more." She closed the book, unable to look at him, her heart laid bare. He was silent for a long moment. Then, she felt his hand, weak but warm, cover hers. She looked up. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. He lifted her fingers to his lips and kissed them, one by one. "You saved me, you know," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that left him breathless. "That night, with the fire, you saved my life, but that is not what I mean." He looked at her, his gaze holding hers with a raw, powerful intensity. "You saved me from myself, from the bitter, empty man I was becoming. It was not just the land I was afraid of losing. I was losing myself. You saved me, Lily." As Caleb recovered, the town of Blackwood Creek began, slowly, to change its mind. The story of the fire, of Bartholomew's mad act, and of Lily's courage spread like wildfire. The narrative had shifted. She was no longer a mysterious outsider. She was a heroine. Jedediah told the story at the general store of how she had stood her ground. Sheriff Brody spoke of her calm demeanor in the face of chaos. The acceptance came in small, quiet gestures. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now offered a hesitant nod. Martha Gable, from the store, set aside a bolt of blue calico fabric she thought Lily might like. One day, a group of girls from the surrounding ranches, whose schooling was sporadic at best, appeared on her porch. Their mother, a woman who had once whispered along with Beatrice, had sent them. "She heard you're good with letters, ma'am," the eldest girl said shyly. "She was wondering if you might teach us." Lily began holding classes twice a week at her kitchen table. She taught them how to read and write, how to sew a straight seam. She was patient and kind, and she became a quiet pillar of the community she had once feared. She had found her place not by conforming, but by being undeniably, courageously herself. One evening, months later, when Caleb was fully healed and the first chill of autumn was in the air, they sat together on the porch steps. A blanket of brilliant stars was spread across the vast, dark sky. The new barn, which Caleb and his neighbors had spent the last 2 months building, stood as a dark, solid silhouette, a testament to resilience and community. Caleb took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Do you remember that first day?" he asked softly. "In the sheriff's office?" It was not much of a wedding. Lily smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It served its purpose." "It did," he agreed. "But it was not a beginning. It was a bargain. Our beginning was later." He turned to her, his face serious in the starlight. "I was thinking, maybe we should have a second wedding, in the church, with flowers from your garden. This time, for real." He was offering to erase the past, to give her the proper celebration she had been denied, to declare his love publicly, without coercion or legal clauses. It was a beautiful, tender gesture. Lily's smile widened. She lifted his hand, the one that held hers, and placed it flat against her chest, directly over her heart. She held it there, letting him feel its steady, rhythmic beat. She looked into his eyes, her own shining with all the love she had once been afraid to feel. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet, absolute certainty. "I already belong to you." Thank you for being a part of our story tonight. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.